Welcome back. So today we're going to talk about this dark beauty called the iFi Go Bar. So first, before we begin, I do want to thank iFi for having a loaner program and loaning this one to me. There's almost no other way I'll get a chance to hear what a really top tier, super powerful dongle sounds like without having a loaner program. So I really do appreciate them running a program like this and giving me the opportunity to hear this one for a couple weeks. So there you go. On the bottom, that is the two outputs. So that is 3.5 single-ended and 4.4 balanced. On the side, we get this is your IEmatch slider, which actually works on both outputs, which is cool. Hardware volume buttons, which is very cool to have as well. And this is a mode button that will switch through some of the modes that we'll talk about in a little bit. So one of my nitpicks on this guy, right on the front, you can kind of, if you squint, you can actually read that text. You actually need a really bright light, and you have to look at it off angle to actually read the text. So not sure who designed this color scheme of gray text on a gray background, but it is nearly impossible to read, especially in the dark. It's very much impossible. So the back of the box has lots of numbers, and some of these are the important numbers. But kind of right off the bat, you can kind of see, like I said, MQA full decoder. That's not all that common to find. Usually it's a renderer. So that's kind of cool. Cirrus Logic DAC. I think it's an XMOS custom Cirrus Logic version of the DAC. Balanced output. So if you're looking at Go Bar, you know that number pretty well. You know how large that number is and how it separates itself from the pack. That is why people look at Go Bar. 475 milliwatts, almost half a watt at 32 ohms and 7.2 volts out. Those are just large numbers compared to other dongles, and that is precisely why this dongle really stands out from other dongles, even other top tier dongles. So output impedance is right around 1 ohms. I think it's just under 1 ohm. So it's not going to be very low like a 0.1. It's going to be more like closer to 1 ohm. And then the power. So how to power this guy? You need a little less than 4 watts. So that is a large number, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So let's jump into it. And I will say that this one is, I think I organized this in 2 areas. I think the functionality on this one, I think there's a lot of top-tier dongles. I think there's top-tier dongles that have sound quality that is just as nice as this guy, but maybe not as many that have the functionality that this one has. And I thought that's what actually separated the Go Bar apart from other top-tier dongles. And I think if you read, this one's been out for a few months, if you read other reviews, if you read the awards that this one has received, you sort of know the sound quality is top tier. So I didn't necessarily doubt that it was going to sound amazing, and it does. But what really caught me are some of the things that I use day to day, that I do manually, that are sort of built into a dongle, which is rare for me. So let's kind of walk through those. And I think right away, so that power, that 475 milliwatts, that almost half watt, powerful enough to drive planars. And the problem with most planars on lower power dongles is they sound noticeably flat and small. Even planars like KZ's PR1 Pro, which was actually, they bumped the sensitivity just to make it a little easier to drive. And it is easier to drive, but to actually hear it in an optimal way, so it sounds big and open and detailed and the bass hits as hard as it should, you actually do need quite a bit of power. And maybe not 475 milliwatts, that sort of takes you into full size range, but yeah, there is a pretty big gap between lower power dongles and a big powerful dongle like this one when it comes to planars. And I've been listening to Michael Bruce's S12, his retuned version of that, and it's really designed to optimize that S12 driver and have a big meaty low end, full extension on the treble, and you can hear it all the way out as far as you can hear, and beautiful imaging, and a lot of that gets lost on lower power dongles. So I was super happy to actually hear a top tier dongle that didn't mangle the sound on a planar. So yeah, I think that's probably my number one. It's a power feature, but it really is tied to the sound, which we'll get to in a little bit. So balanced out, I am a fan of balanced out as well. I have tons of balanced out cables. Q5K, ES100, those kind of got me in the mode of, if your dongle has both outputs, always use the balance, because the power is probably twice as much as the single-ended. So I just got in the habit of always using balanced out. I tend to leave the stock cables in the boxes, only use balance out, because it is going to be the better sounding output. And here I would say the same thing on this dongle as well. XBass Plus. So those of you who follow my reviews, occasionally I talk about putting micropore on vents to give you a 5 dB bass boost-ish. Much easier to just hit one button, right? Hit the mode button, 5 dB or so of bass boost, and analog, I think, is how they actually call it, how they implemented it. Nothing easier than that. And it's actually super handy, and it's actually done very well, and it sounds great. And now I realize why everyone with a Griffin always turns on XBass, because it does sound really, really good. It's a really nice implementation of a bass boost. So going back to some of my recent reviews, all of these sort of involved adding more bass when I was testing them. EA500, Kiwi ears, full-size Ghost, Droplet, had enough bass, but that didn't really help. But, you know, there's just lots and lots of times that I try to increase a little bass. I like a little more bass. Sometimes it's just nice to hear what it sounds like with a little more bass, to have it a little bit more meaty. Give people an option if they end up with a set like EA500. You know, if you can bump that up just a couple dB in bass, then, you know, if you can do it with a button, then you don't really need to use tape or anything else to get it to that point. So small feature that is super, super handy, and I use it a lot. And I actually just kept on XBass because it actually sounds really, really good here. So IEmatch, that's another thing. So I would say it acts somewhat like a impedance adapter. They would say that it's a more complicated version of impedance adapter. They would say that it's really designed to bring sensitive IEMs in line in a, you know, a less noise version with a very powerful output. So what happens with very sensitive IEMs is you can hear a hum or a buzz on sources that have, and it's not limited to this one in particular, but other sources that have high power outputs with sensitive IEMs tend to have a mismatch right there, and it'll cause a little bit of noise. So IEmatch is something they've been using for quite a while to get rid of that noise. But on the other hand, if you are used to using impedance adapters, and if you used them before on balanced armature sets, maybe you like that sound, maybe you have other sources that needed impedance adapters, it's super handy to have it built in. No need to grab the adapter. And even with sets like, so QKZ Con, Zero, both of those guys, if you increase the impedance, you increase the bass level. It's sort of a second version of XBass on those particular sets because of the crossover. KZ ZVX, that one actually brings the treble down. So that's because they implemented a crossover at a different part. But, you know, yeah, so I sort of agree with what they say. IEmatch is great on that mismatch between a sensitive IEM and a high power source. But for those of you who just like to play around with different frequency response and how it responds to impedance, it's great to be able to flip that switch and see what happens. So like I said, the results are a little less predictable than XBass, and you always have to try it. But on those three sets, you'll actually see a pretty good difference in frequency response by flipping the IEmatch button. Hardware volume buttons always seems like minor until, but it is a big plus. And I actually have a dongle that didn't work with the title application on volume simply because it didn't have hardware buttons. And I read it in the description of the item, and it said, this will not work with the application because we can't control the volume, and you end up with a title application that was just blasting at full volume. So I don't take for granted hardware volume buttons. I used to kind of chuckle when people would say, but the dongle doesn't have hardware buttons for volume. But now I understand it 100% why that's important to some people, and just general compatibility with all of the applications that people use. So turbo gain button. So high-low gain. Again, this is another thing that I actually use on my Q5K more than anything else because it has two different modes. But it's sort of a last chance, right? You plugged in a full-size headphone, a very hard-to-drive earphone, and even if you're on the balanced output, you still think you need a little more volume. This gives you that 6 dB of kind of just-in-case volume. You know, your last chance to kind of get it to where you need it to be. So again, small feature, cool to have on a dongle. You don't see it all that often. Other cool things, MQA, like I said, I'm actually a big Tidal user. I use MQA a lot. I love the desktop application on my Windows box because exclusive mode works really well, and you could actually do exclusive mode across different sources. So I have a few plugged into my PC, and I tend to swap between them. That doesn't interfere with Windows sound. So yeah, it's actually pretty cool to use that application on Windows. Like I said, this one does do MQA pass-through, and it is a MQA full decoder, not just a renderer. So it actually does unfolding in the DAC and not some hybrid of application and DAC here. So a little bit rare. Digital filters. So I think these are less noticeable. I think it takes a set, even a planar set with kind of a Detail King planar set like Michael Bruce's Aero. I think you can actually hear slight differences between the filters, but I don't know. They talk about their GTO filter, and so I tried that one, but I think it is a kind of a less noticeable difference. But if you use it for a long enough period of time, you could probably pick one out that you prefer. And this one does do upgradable firmware, which again is sort of a thing that you don't see too often on dongles, but a dongle at this price, you're sort of expecting that feature to be there. So sound quality, I haven't really tried a ton of dongles, but this one is technically in the ballpark of my portable and my desktop. I think it's kind of right there, and it was close enough that I didn't feel anything was missing. I didn't feel any need to push this through a headphone app. I think on its own, this one sort of competes up there in portables and desktops that are kind of in the same price point as this one. And this one, it's just not colored. It's a very neutral, kind of maybe an organic, analog-ish, but not really colored in a way that's noticeable. And I do think it's a little bit less noticeable, less musical. It's got nice extension, like I said, on planars. You can actually get all that treble extension, which is kind of nice to find in a dongle. But I would always use XBass, and I think that is one of my only nitpicks on the sound, is it lost some of the bass impact on a set like an Aero. So Michael attuned that to have kind of a meaty bass to it, and when I first heard it for the first time on a headphone amp, I said, well, maybe that's probably 1 to 2 dB more than it should be, but let me try it on my topping, and then on topping it was almost perfectly where it should be. And then to hear it on this, I would say it's about 1 or 2 below where it is on the other two. So I tended to always use the XBass. I think the XBass kind of pushes it right into the zone of some of my other sources. So again, I actually dig the XBass and always use it, but close enough to my portables and my desktop where you didn't really notice anything out of place, even on planars. And I think that's why this one reviews so well, why I received awards, because there are other top tier dongles. They all tend to be, do everything well. There's nothing out of place. And why I put all this up there is because there's a lot of features that sort of push this one or separate it from the other top tier sets that also do everything right and nothing really wrong. But for me, this one does really pass rule number 1. Don't mess with the imaging and stage. I talked about Michael Bruce's Aero. It's tuned to have fantastic stage and imaging. And if this didn't really pass rule number 1, I would probably not be talking about it. I probably would have just sent it back and said, thanks for loaning it to me, but not quite planar ready. But this one is probably the first dongle that I've actually heard where I didn't run it through a headphone app just to get around this problem. So is it a desktop replacement? I would say no. I would say it's close. Like I said, it's pretty close to a battery-powered portable to a desktop amp, but I do prefer it hooked up to my PC simply because of those power requirements. It's got to do about 4 watts. So if you're looking at a USB 2 port, that's about 2 watts, 2.5 watts. To get to 4 watts, you need a USB 3 port and hope that your phone can actually output all 4 watts, which I'm not sure that's all that common. So I did prefer plugging this one straight into my USB-C port on my motherboard to get the power requirements that it can really use to its, because these numbers, 475 watts, that is based on getting a full power draw from your power source. So I do think of it more of I would plug this into my laptop, and when I used to work on site and had to bring in my laptop and had to bring in some music listening device, I do think that this one fits that role pretty well. Not so much a desktop replacement, but a very high quality source that you could use plugged into your laptop and use and listen to music all day, not worried about your cell phone battery dying, because this one does, your phone, I noticed the power draw on it, and I'll talk about that in a second. It's actually, it draws a lot of power from your phone if you just listen to it for a couple hours. So on the con side, so I think number one is always going to be the price on this one, right? $329, I think, is the full retail price. Certainly on the high side of dongles, it's right there with portables, and even some desktop DAC amps are going to be about the same price. So as I said, you get a ton of features with it, and I can sort of justify that price because you get a lot of features with it, and it's a ton of power in a very, very small box. But, there's sort of no mistaking that the price is way up there. And even on a $100 or $200 planar set, you're talking about a $300 dongle to drive it. So on the other hand, sometimes it's better to buy the one dongle that has everything and not the 5 that don't. So if that's what you are, I tend to do that with IEMs. You keep on buying the budget ones and hope that one of them is better than a $100 set, but 5 $20 sets don't necessarily equal one $100 set. And then lastly, the power consumption. Perhaps they could have been a little more efficient with it, but it really does eat through a phone battery at a surprising rate. I started out on my phone, but like I said, I really switched it to my desktop because it's just a easier way to keep it powered for longer periods of time to listen to it. So that is what I got on the power bar. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.